transmit a simple message. And the message is that a lot of empirical research as well as philosophical research into the methods to control corruption suggests that the old truth that the way you practice, you will act in a critical situation is being grossly neglected by the predominant institutional model of addressing corruption. Assuming that David Hume had a point when he said in one of his essays that people can develop on the assumption that you are not completely crooked, that you are basically a good person, you can develop virtue by practicing. And practicing requires two stages. The first stage is know yourself, that is properly diagnose your own moral situation. And the second stage is what Hume calls the frequent perusal of virtue, self-interruption, repeated enforcement of the moral standards and virtue in everyday life. And Hume believes this will eventually lead to the development of a proper character. Theodore Roosevelt took this very seriously, so he developed a list of 12 virtues that he wanted to acquire, and he dedicated 1 week at a time to the practice of each virtue, so he believed that he had 4 weeks of a go at each virtue per year, and he was confident that following this strong empiricist view of developing character would bring him to the sort of person, to become the sort of person that he desired to be. My point will be that the institutional models of controlling corruption, models that are based basically on legal positivism, on sanctions, on legally prescribed rules, and on the idea that the greater the power of the institutions and the greater the normative strength of the social discourse that is essentially repressive, the less corruption there will be, is mistaken. And that the flourishing institutions in a modern liberal society, flourishing liberal institutions, in fact produce a counterproductive situation in social reality where people are systematically discouraged from practicing the virtues and the strength of character that are required to have strong internal sanctions and to be able to foster a moral atmosphere that will in itself prevent corruption. So in this sense I will speak very briefly about what it means to have corporate virtue, what is the relationship between the corporate virtue and individual virtue, and how this can be achieved in a modern liberal society. Petrus and I were involved at various stages in monitoring the situation in corruption control in Serbia and have witnessed a shift which has now become official policy from the solely repressive models of controlling corruption to the more ethics-driven model. One of these shifts is clear in the design of the new anti-corruption strategy, which is in process at the moment and which is supposed to be based on ethics. The process has been unsuccessful so far in Serbia, and some of the reasons for this include the absence of any ethicists from the composition of the bodies that have worked on the ethics strategy, and also they have resulted from an absence of a social debate on the prerequisites of the introduction of controls of corruption that will be based on the so-called internals, on the internal moral sanctions. In an important sense, the legal regulation of corruption is based on externalities. The law is an externality, and in practice, the legislation that leads to the positive regulation and the external regulation of corruption is a banal process, which is the result of a political compromise. So legal positivism can rarely conform to moral criteria, even though in the generic sense the justification of law is often based on ideas of natural justice. The legal regulation of corruption, which is based on sanctions, also suffers from the common problem in the theory of punishment, the theory of legal sanctions, and that is a problem that relates to the ineffectiveness of general deterrence. The general deterrence requires the presumption of an almost perfect rationality of actors, which means that any actor will be able to critically distinguish between the consequences of one's actions, both positive and negative, and thus to judge that if the system is sufficiently effective and the punishments prescribed for those actions are sufficiently severe, it doesn't pay to commit a crime. Experience has shown that in many countries, in many situations, the general deterrence model simply doesn't work, because alongside with the gradual increases in the severity of sanctions, often there are gradual increases in the rates of violent crimes. And one of the explanations, I'm not aspiring to be conclusive on this, but one of the explanations in theory has been that the reason for this is that people tend to learn from the social elites, from the government and from the laws, and if a government is ready to take a man's life as punishment for a crime, that also, in addition to trying to scare off the offenders from offending in the future, it also sends a cognitively important message that taking someone's life is somehow legitimate, conceivable. And this is why in countries where capital punishment is a regularity, there are regular increases in violent crimes. A similar situation applied to legal controls of corruption. If you look at the aesthetics, if you want, of philosophical arguments, you will see that this aesthetics pervades political theory, and the more elaborate theories are, the less connected they tend to be with reality. Today we had a brief discussion about the social contract theory and its explanatory power in the context of liberal political philosophy, despite the fact that everybody who propagates the social contract theory agrees that it's basically logically incoherent, because conditions for the creation of a congress of completely solitary individuals that it presupposes can't be logically envisaged. So it's basically a theory that tries to explain the origins of society and the political community without pretending to be materially true. And this fictitious way of thinking also has seeped into a legal theory, and especially into the theory of social controls, and it also applies to this issue of controlling corruption. One of the problems in controlling, if you want, social deviations in general, and crime in particular, is this evasive, irrational element that is present in the motivation to commit various actions. Dostoevsky wrote about this in his Letters from the Underground, when he described the motivations of the underground man, irrational and destructive as they are, as equally constitutive of his, if you want, ontological identity as the rational inclinations and arguments. And in this context, it becomes increasingly important for us to understand in what ways society can foster those sorts of value systems and those sorts of models of internalization of values and norms that will lead to self-controls. This is the fragment from Letters from the Underground that I have just referred to. Unlike the external regulations, internal regulations are capable of impacting the irrational motivation through the taking over of values that a person wishes to internalize and incorporate into one's character. It is a more holistic way of regulation than external and positivistic legal regulation can ever be. And in this sense, it accentuates what Sylvia mentioned as a distinction between responsibility and liability. If you take into account the composite nature of human motivation, the dynamic factors in acting, you will see that liability is based on the rational nature of the law, and it can only relate to the rational motivation, whereas when it relates to the irrational motivation, it basically collapses into those theories of incapacitation. It does not have a forward-looking perspective if it does not appeal directly to the rational side of human nature, whereas internal regulations are able to also, to some extent, encompass the irrational motives. And this is one of the reasons why corruption control has been conceived increasingly as a matter for ethical regulation. The regulation of corruption in the public service, which is the primary domain of corruption discussed in the institutionalist and, if you want, to some extent, functionalist discourse on corruption, has been the proliferation of positive norms and the idea that laws should be based on an evolving liberal political philosophy especially in the less developed countries such as ours, which should filter through from the more developed political and legal systems, and which invariably are based on criteria such as rights, liberties, entitlements, duties, and things like that, where little room is left for the principles of human motivation that relate more to the irrational side of the human nature, such as the principle of satisfaction, for example. The concept of satisfaction that is peculiar to a liberal discourse is that which is based on interest, the satisfaction of interest. The idea of freedom that is inherent in the liberal discourse is essentially a negative freedom. It is a freedom from interference into the private sphere that has led to the paradox in public life today, and that is that in the recruitment of public servants, in the conceptualizations of the public profile that people who are members of key public services should really have, you have a strict distinction between what is a private thing and what is a public thing. So basically you are banned from discussing virtue, because virtue is something that stretches across one's character and can't be divided between the public and the private spheres. During Knyaz Nikola, in the organic stage of the development of the Montenegrin society, there was a code of ethics for police officers. And that code of ethics is inscribed today on the wall of the Montenegrin Police Academy in Danilovgrad, with, I think, 10 basic principles that the police officer, or someone who is a candidate for the police officer, should satisfy. One of those principles is that the police officer must never socialize with adulterers, gamblers, cheaters, liars, and people of dubious morality. Another one is that the police officer should immediately be dismissed if he is found hanging idly late in pubs, which is telling about the way virtue was conceived, and which is in a way an organic way of perceiving how a public official should behave. Can someone who is disloyal on a private level, who is an adulterer, be considered a loyal public servant? Can someone be completely immoral in public life, because there's no legal requirement that you should be moral and not cheat on your wife or husband, and at the same time be completely moral and show the exemplary virtue in public life? This debate is basically banned in the liberal society because it's considered to violate the political correctness of the day and to transgress the boundary between the public and the private. This basically leads to a situation where one is unable to understand what is really expected of public officials. I recently had a poll with people working in various public services who are going through a course in ethics, and asked them what they considered to be the key virtues for their services, for the taxation service, the police service, the intelligence service, whatever. And after a long deliberation, all of them were able to come up with some sort of virtues. And then when asked whether these virtues were in any way inculcated in the way people are recruited, or the services were managed, or the overseeing of the services works that is conducted, all of them said that this had nothing to do with the realities. The realities were legally positivistic. You have to not have any criminal convictions, to have 3 years of experience, a university degree, and that's it. And if you're lucky, you get into whatever service you want to work in. One of the problems with ethics is that if you want to have a comprehensive model of regulating behavior, it is very difficult to shy away consistently from prying into some aspect of private life. Ethics is essentially about self-discipline, and self-discipline is not just a normative issue, but also a dynamic issue. You need to create conditions for someone to be sufficiently motivated to exercise self-interruption and self-discipline. And the institutional environment, unlike the common narrative suggests, the institutional environment carries part of the blame for the dynamic aspect of motivation to act in a self-disciplined way. The liberal ideology would have us all believe that based on the meritocratic principles, everybody is solely responsible for one's actions, at least the actions that theoretically observed one can control and one can interrupt. Whereas in reality, I would resort to a milder way of looking at the issue. We're all born into certain social positions, and we are born into a social environment which in itself presents what Heidegger called the inconspicuous familiarity of the world we lived into a disworldly, he would say, context, which has unnoticeable, seemingly unnoticeable normative value that impacts the dynamic aspect of the way we are predisposed to act. So if you look at the nature of various societies, you see that corruption levels vary in the Nordic countries compared to the, for example, South European countries, not to say the Southeast European countries, simply because there's a different social ethos. There's a different way of thinking about social relationships. There's a different threshold of tolerance of various sorts of informality, which is far greater in the South than it tends to be in the Northern societies. And these societies in themselves perform a formative role on the dynamic aspect of motivation of people in public office with regard to how they act. So the Humean concept of the key role of exercise, both on the individual and on the institutional levels, is upheld throughout the range of observable social realities that we can cite as examples for our thesis. Societies that insist on legal positivism often neglect this practice because they shy away, as most liberal societies do, from positing substantive virtues that people should have. Especially this is true in multicultural societies where key virtues are often defined by cultural and religious background. So the liberal society sees its role as being neutral between those value sets, and that leads to the possibility that people who subscribe to no sets of values, who perceive themselves as completely amoral, will be treated institutionally as equals to those who adopt a kind of morality, whatever the basis or the foundation of that morality is, whether it's religious or cultural or conditioned by personal experience. That superficial equality of process, equality of participation, equality before the institutions, leaves out the substantive issues because they are sensitive. And basically this means that many contemporary societies simply abolish the idea that they should direct people to exercise certain values and certain aspects of character, and it's always much easier, of course, to regulate corruption by legal positivistic measures because they are easily provable, they are visible, they are quantifiable. It's very much the same as the policies of the governments in Southeastern Europe with regard to external donations. The first reflex is to establish 20 new laws in the first month in office, because the new laws are something that can be proven black and white, that you are doing something. The fact that these laws may never be upheld in reality, may never be effectively applied, is something that remains to be proven in the longer term. In short, liberal societies tend to default on the concept of exercise of character, because they tend to default on taking a stand on what it is to have character. Liberal societies are not organic societies, and this is proven by the fact that within large liberal societies you have small kernels of organic societies which in their dynamics and in their structure show the influence of the morality of the members that is in stark contrast with the failure to exert that influence on the character of the citizens by the liberal society as a whole. Look at the religious communities. Religious communities tend to be communities with tightly knit and intertwined values and clear expectations about what virtue is in no uncertain terms. And you often see that contrary, or going even further than what Hume argued, not even people of basically good character are able to exercise their character and their virtue in such tightly knit organic communities. Even people with no prerequisites in terms of pre-existing virtue are able to be considerably transformed. This is the common biblical notion of a prostitute turned nun and a gangster turned saint. Because there's a specific value strategy that is involved in the catalytic influence of an organic community on the values of a member. A society that is based on the idea of negative liberties, that is based on the idea of tolerance, which is a negative value. Tolerance, if I tolerate you, it doesn't mean that I love you. It doesn't mean that I identify with you. A society that is based on a political ideology that arises from essentially negative values and negative criteria is unable to exert that sort of influence. And this is why we often end up in situations where we exercise the opposite of virtue. We live in societies where, for example, it is considered politically incorrect to talk about love between members of a community, because love is a taboo, is a new taboo, it is a private sphere concept. But it is not forbidden to have widespread pornography, which exists for public consumption instead of the more organic discourse from organic communities about mutual love, mutual loyalty, mutual solidarity. It is often said that in a liberal society institutions exist because they are regulators. But institutions can also be explained as instruments for self-identification in communities that are too large and too complex to allow sufficient transparency for their members to directly identify with one another. In an ancient community, an organic community, most people knew each other, or at least they knew each other through intermediaries, and they were able to identify with each other and to show a high degree of solidarity and a high consistency of values. In modern multicultural communities, nobody knows anyone, and institutions could serve as intermediaries in the sense that if I can't identify with you, if you are in a particular situation vis-à-vis the institutions, assuming that the institutions are democratic, equal and just, and that they would treat you in the same way as they would treat me, I can identify with your situation vis-à-vis the state and the institutions by virtue of knowing something about the justness and legitimacy of the institutions. Institutions are not only regulators, they serve important cognitive and value-transmitting purposes within a community. The discourse, and I will finish with this, the discourse that reduces, the reductionist discourse, that reduces institutions to the role of regulators, that reduces solidarity and liberties to the level of interest and the protection of interests, that reduces the talk about virtue and character to the discourse of rights, privacy and protection from interference, is not a good context for the development of internalities, internal controls that could serve as an effective substitute for the repressive measures. And this is perhaps the reason why the most liberal societies today tend to have the harshest penalties prescribed for various crimes, and the most, if you want, the most extensive authorizations granted to various intelligence and other services to trample citizens' privacy from quite a different side, but no less drastically, no less threateningly than would be the case if we would have an open discussion about virtue and what a certain society sees as its public morality. Thank you.
Thank you very much.